And welcome back, everyone, to the Bitcoin Business Bureau. I'm your host, as always, LitecoinLeader. Normally, you'd find me on Wednesdays in my truck driving around, picking up sushi from the grocery store. And I actually did do that, and I did record a video. Unfortunately, my audio failed. So now I'm re-recording this, but we're going to make it that much better a second go around. So today I wanted to talk about a little bit of history, a little bit different than what I normally talk about. And I know other people that you may be familiar with talk a lot about history, but I'm going to try and put it into an economic sense so that we can understand the purposes of why we're where we are. And I'm going to watch my language as closely as I can because this is on a public video on YouTube. But I will say this, I will probably be doing a Patreon-only version of this where I expand upon some of the whys and the hows as opposed to the what's. We're going to stick to what factually happened today. So first off, we're going to go back to one of the most famous years in economics that we've talked about a lot, 1913. And two things happened. Then that year, the Federal Reserve was created and the federal income tax was created. We all know about the events in Jekyll Island that led up to that. If you don't, I will talk about that at some point as well. But there's plenty of videos on Jekyll Island out there as well. If you haven't read Grisham's book, I think it's Grisham. It's Creature from Jekyll Island. It's a must-read. So, as will be another book I'll mention briefly. So, 1913. So, that's where we start. All right, President Wilson is in charge. And these two things happen. But what's happening globally? What's happening in the economy? What's going on in the world? Well, in a couple of years, World War I is going to start. And I almost said, they call it the Great War first because they didn't know about World War II yet. But World War I is about to start, and the U.S. gets pulled in a few years. Now, I remember when I was taught about World War I, they told us that, well, first, they didn't tell us a whole lot about leading up to that, but they did tell us that the start of the war was the murder of Archduke Ferdinand, which I believe was Hungarian or Prussian. I'm not sure. It was some European country. Basically, no one in America really cared. And so everyone wondered, why are we getting involved in this war? So what really was going on is that there was a lot of... The U.S. was isolationist back then. They were very nationalistic. And the economy was doing great back then. After Reconstruction, post-Civil War era was probably one of the best economic times for our country. Of course, they don't tell you that because there's no Federal Reserve back then. But I digress. So those who want the Federal Reserve, obviously, they want it really bad, so they're trying to get it in place. That hence Jekyll Island in 1913. But they also want the U.S. to stop being so isolationist and nationalistic. So what happens is that the Germans are doing a lot of submarine attacks, and as part of World War I, that's affecting both the U.S. Tourism and trade. The Lusitania allegedly was involved in it, but was sunk by a German submarine. I don't know if that's true or not. That's what I read somewhere. But I also saw that. So that was one event. So eventually, one thing leads to another, and the U.S. gets pulled into World War I. Well, World War I wraps up around 1919. Spanish flu happens about that same time, 1918, 1919. Don't hold me to the dates exactly, but it's about the end of the teens of the 1900s. That all leads to the Treaty of Versailles, which is pretty much marks the end of World War I, and also led to the first version of a world congregation of leaders in some form, which is the League of Nations. The League of Nations was formed as part of the Treaty of Versailles, and that eventually led to the United Nations later on, after World War II. So in the middle of World War II, so before World War II, and we're just getting in World War I. World War I ends. Now we're about 1921, Versailles. Roaring 20s happen, another economic boom after a war. Tends to happen that way. And then comes the Great Depression. The stock market crashed 29. Great Depression that leads into the 30s. FDR starts doing other more government work and being people to be dependent upon the government for jobs and work. And then World War II comes. And then World War II, and we get pulled into that. I'm not going to talk about the details how we got into that, but I know it went on to 1945. But before 45, an interesting meeting happened in 1944 in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Now, that was a meeting of a lot of world leaders who happened to be the Allied countries of that time, And all these leaders were meeting with FDR, and they were talking about economics. And the actual Bretton, we all know it as Bretton Woods now, but that was the location. The actual name of the meeting was the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference. Davos, anyone? It's basically world leaders getting together, talking about the economy and how to shape the world economics. So as part of that, in 1944, the U.S. dollar is made as the reserve currency for the globe. So that leads on to a whole bunch of more history, and I'm looking at my notes so I don't say anything wrong or get things too far out of order. But also at the time of this, we're in the 40s now, so FDR started when he's doing his fireside chats on the radio, using new media to reach people directly. Then in the 40s came television, and television started reaching people and making the world smaller. So there was a bigger push by several, I won't say who, but there was a bigger push towards globalization at that point because the world was shrinking, because not a lot of people were flying yet, but there's telephone, there's radio, and there's television showing you what's going on around the globe almost in real time. So that's in the 40s and 50s, and it's shrinking the world. So then, with, again, a perspective of the global world, the 1950s happens, and then the red wave, the communism, the Cold War, all that, McCarthyism happens, and Congress gets everybody in uproar about communism. So then we start, the U.S. really starts becoming the police force of the world, being the strong arm of the UN and the backing of UN and the World Reserve, and pushing their dollars out there and backing them allegedly with gold. And so the U.S. gets involved in conflicts, not wars, over in Asia. They get involved in Korea. They get involved in Vietnam. And all the meantime, that system during the 60s, behind the scenes, they're setting up the petrodollar system. So that's where this is the other book I'm going to mention, the Confessions of an Economic Hitman. This is where we had governmental people in contractor roles going to other countries and saying, hey, if you just build your infrastructure and do this, this, and this, and we'll fund it for you. We'll give you the loans in U.S. dollars. You just have to pay it back. But your economy is going to boom. You just have to build these roads, these towers, this infrastructure, and the dollars will come to you from an economic infusion standpoint. Well, that happened for 10 to 20 years in the Middle East, in Asia, in South and Central America, and all it created were a bunch of countries that were debt slaves. And those countries are pretty much verbatim the list of countries that are getting together to talk about Bitcoin of late. Coincidence? We'll see. So we fast forward to that, and then we get to 1971, and that's where we're starting to have issues with oil and gold, and that's when President Nixon takes the U.S. off of the gold standard and creates the petrodollar. Now, it's not with the fanfare. It's just part of a speech. It just happens. It's not a headline event. But it kicks off a series of changes of events in the 70s, where eventually you have, Nixon leaves Ford holding the bag, then Ford leads to President Carter, and the oil crisis and OPEC and the Middle East and the hostage situation, all these different world events pulling the U.S. further and further involved into conflicts, predominantly with countries over oil, because we're now a petrodollar system. So we wind up for the next 20 years in Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Libya, all these different issues until the Reagan years, and then we get the different view of the trickle-down economics, but we're still involved in conflict overseas, the Falkland Islands, I don't know, you could probably name another conflict that I'm not even remembering, but we were in Iraq twice, we were in Iran, so all it leads up to 2001. So in 2001, we all know what happened in September, but that led to a war on terrorism that still hasn't been declared over yet. So technically, we're still in a country at war, which gives the government even more authority to do things in times of war. Following along yet? Okay, so why does all this matter? Okay, so what we've done is in the past 100 years, we have gone from having the United States being a very strong economic power, being the world leader, but isolationist. Like over 100 years ago, before World War I, we're doing a great job, we're fine to ourselves, you take care of your own business, we'll take care of ours. That was a very nationalistic nationalistic, isolationist viewpoint, similar to the previous administration that we had. Which is, again, you want to take care of your own business before you get involved in everyone else's. Interesting concept, but that doesn't fit the narrative of creating a one world currency or one world entity. So it's when you have one entity or one choke point, one issue that you can kind of go after, then you can throttle everything. Okay, you can like if you have an issue with just something there, just something, in like if the dollar has an issue, or if you get, when you get to like one chain link, and you basically weaken the whole chain. So it's kind of like the supply chain right now. So like we have supply issues, we have supply chain issues. It's not necessarily that we don't have the goods, that we can't always get them from A to B, because we've created this just-in-time economy, and that leads me to, I know I'm all over the place. I'm trying to keep my thoughts in order, but in the late 90s and the early 2000s, in most of the 2000s, maybe in the 2010s, was a push towards outsourcing. That's because the wages were so high in the U.S., but they were still low overseas, and that's where a lot of the goods were. So not only did we push things overseas, we pushed jobs overseas, and we pushed our supply chain overseas. So long ago, the days of the farmer in Iowa making the wheat that wound up in the cereal that General Mills processed in Michigan, that wound up in a supermarket box in Ohio, that is not the supply chain anymore. Now we have a just-in-time and overseas supply chain. We get so much from overseas, and we ship so many things overseas. It's really difficult if something along that chain breaks. Like, for example, if gas prices go up too high, trucks stop rolling. But our just-in-time delivery system now says that we don't want to have much in warehouses. We want it to be either in the truck or at its final destination. Because we don't want any storage. We want the storage to be the trucks in motion getting to the next store. But if that Thursday delivery from that bread truck doesn't happen, that store doesn't have bread. Now, why did that truck not get there? It could be that he didn't have the ability to pick up the original supplies. He couldn't get from A to B. He couldn't afford the gas, whatever. All these different things could be possible, all the way back to the origins of the food or the item he was delivering. All that on the supply chain, any element on that supply chain is liable to be broken and break the whole chain and wind up with nothing on your shelf for sale. And with all those different break points and all those different single points of failure, much like having a single point of failure for a world economy, like if one of those breaks, all hell breaks loose. So the U.S. has been pulled into a global position that they went from taking care of their own business to having to take care of everybody else's. And they've tried to manipulate that situation with the dollar and exporting their inflation. But that's pretty much come to an end, because every nook and cranny that they've explored for exporting their dollars with selling treasury bills or playing with federal rates or so on, it's pretty much over. So I went over a lot today. Hopefully this history lesson helped, gave us perspective why they want. Well, I can't really go into why they want it, but I can tell you that there is a reason that they want it. And the U.S. is being kind of painted to the corner of that have to go this way, because that's where they've been pushed back to based on the recent policies that they've reenacted. So I'm going to have to stop there. Maybe I'll do a Patreon video to try to explain myself further, probably after my AMA tonight. We'll see. But I just want to get this out there and just give you some perspective of how some of the things go together, why there is so much perspective on a global economy, because the entire economy is global now, and it's the first time it's been so interknit or interwoven, and the media and everything is all pushing it that way, and all the conflicts push it that way. So this is why we say everything's entangled, but they're trying to keep it in silos and just like only talk about the interest rates, only talk about gas, only talk about food, only talk about this country, only talk about that country. But when you put it all together in the big picture, you really get some different illustrations as you step back and see the big scope of things. So a lot said today. I'm probably going to have to make more videos. We'll see. So for now, I'm going to close the door in the bureau, say follow leader one more time, and I will talk to you soon. Take care.